Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Paul Schnackenburg on the line, and we are going to be talking about how in the cybersecurity space and the software industry at large, we have a software quality problem, not necessarily a security problem. And of course, those words echo what Jen Easterly, the director of CISA, said some weeks ago. And so Paul and I, we kind of delve into that idea. Paul, in fact, wrote an article about this as well. And we kind of talk about software quality and, you know, how that has impact on our cybersecurity posture as an industry. So that and lots more on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Syrewicze, and I've got Paul Schnackenburg with me today. Surprise, right? How's it going, Paul?
I'm good, Andy. How are you?
Good. You know, we laugh, but, you know, we've had so many good conversations lately, and we keep coming up with episode ideas, you know, so it's only natural that we have you back on the show as regularly as we do. So it's good to have you again, my friend.
I appreciate it. It's a good chat always with you on these podcasts.
Definitely. And the chat that we have lined up today is an interesting one, and there's some areas where we've lightly touched on in different episodes of the show, and I'm sure I'm going to reference this episode and that episode, et cetera, but I think this is a conversation that needs to be had, not just by us, but I think by I want to say cybersecurity community, but realistically, this probably needs to be the technology industry at large, right? And of course, We're talking about how we have a software quality problem. And that's not me saying that, even though I agree with it. That's not me saying that. This is actually a quote that came from Jen Easterly, who's the head of CISA. And she basically said, hey, we don't, and this is quote, we don't have a cybersecurity problem. We have a software quality problem, unquote. And it's true. It's true. And I think this conversation is even more sobering, now that we're 3-4 months post CrowdStrike incident now, which I think is the big recent incident that's kind of brought this whole conversation back to light, right? In that CrowdStrike making an update to their engine, their definitions. I don't remember exactly. That I have that in a separate episode. I'll link in the show notes where we actually talk about that whole thing. But I mean, that impacted, if I remember correctly, like 1% of machines, but a very important 1% of machines worldwide, right? Anyway. I know you, Paul, you actually wrote an article on this very same topic, which is another reason I'm having you on the episode to talk about this. And I'll be sure to link Paul's article in the show notes as well. Fantastic article, lays out this argument very succinctly. And so we got a lot to talk about, Paul, here. And I guess before I get started, I think I've covered most of the intro-related items. Anything you want to add before we talk about risk?
I suppose give a little bit of a background to the reason I wrote the article. So
sure.
We have covered this on the podcast before, but a long time ago, so new listeners may not remember. So I run my own business as an MSP here in Australia. I have a small handful of clients. So I sort of deal with this on the technology providers end as well, right? So I got to pick what software do I want to provide to my clients, and why do I want to provide that, and how do I manage security and whatever. And the instigating factor here was one of my clients is a school. One of the teachers contacted me and said, hey, I found this application. I'd like to install it on all the computers in the classroom. I had a look at the application and I thought, it's fine, looks fine to me, doesn't look like a malicious app, but let's see if there's a cloud-based alternative. Not because, oh my God, I found that there was some big problem with this application, but simply because I can't be sure, right? The application from somewhere. There's some developer somewhere. I don't know whether they've hidden anything bad in there. And even if they haven't hidden anything bad in there, it's built on top of open source software, because nearly everything is today. Any of those open source packages could be malicious or have a flaw in them that allows people to get into the network. So all of a sudden, right, I go, well, this is just adding more risk to the environment.
Yep.
Every application that I add is adding more risk. If it's a SaaS app sitting in a web browser, there's still a risk, but it's a much smaller risk because it's contained in a modern browser with modern security controls.
Right.
And it's not an app that runs locally that has full control over the, not full control, but has, access to the whole system.
Yeah.
And that's sort of where the conversation started, or the idea started, and then that turned into the article.
And I think that's an important point you make, right? Is when you start looking at a given application, right? And you're responsible for the safety of an environment, a business, right? End users. You have to ask that question like, okay, it looks fine. Do I know that it's fine? And I'm not sure there's any application in the world that I could be 100%, yeah, that's fine. Now, younger Andy and less experienced Andy would have been very naive about that, right? But I've got enough gray hairs now to where I'm like, I'm not like that anymore. So, like, for example, I don't remember what browser extension it was. I was looking to do something inside of Edge, and I had a buddy like, well, just install a browser extension to take care of that. And so I start looking at this browser extension, and the first thing I always look at is like, okay, yeah, it appears to do what I'm looking for. And then I immediately go to, what rights does this extension need? Oh, you can view all information on all websites. That's an instant no, sorry, moving on. You know what I mean? And so when I look at any application, there are times where it's like, okay, I really want to use this, but it's only been around for 3 months, or I use Homebrew on my Mac for as a package manager, right, to install a lot of applications. And the one nice metric that it has is it tracks how many installs has there been in the last 30 days, the last 90 days, the last year. And it's like, okay, this has only been installed 18 times in the last 3 months. I'm not going to trust this, right? And so, as you get older, I think in IT, more seasoned in your IT career, I think we ask these questions more. And I think it's part of the ecosystem that we live in now as well, too, right? Is that there's more attacks happening from more interesting threat vectors, I guess I would say, more varied threat vectors, and some vectors that we don't always expect, right? And so I have a really hard time trusting software today, I guess, is where I'm going with this. And I guess the first area we should kind of dive into here is risk, right? We're talking about risk and everything that we've talked about so far. And Eric Siren and I, we did an episode, I want to say 4 or 5 weeks ago as of this recording, where we actually talked about mitigating vendor risk. Okay, I'm an IT director or a senior sysadmin. I need a vendor to do X. How do I make the right choice of vendor to not only solve my problem, but find a trusted vendor that I don't have to worry about them getting breached, or realistically, I don't have to worry very much about them getting breached, right? And so I feel like this conversation, we're getting a little bit more micro with that conversation, and that we're not talking about a specific vendor, but we're zeroing in on a specific application, right? And so, going back to your story about your education customer, you looked at a suggested application and you made a risk assessment. And that's probably the same assessment I would have made too. If there's some sort of cloud-based version of this, let's offload all that security, that whole security conversation, and we're going to offload that to the browser and let the browser deal with it, right? Which I think is smart. And that's probably where I would have ended up as well. But I mean, Paul, you talked about the situation. Are there any other considerations you would look at specifically for determining risk of an app other than just, on-prem versus cloud? Anything else you look for specifically? I know I'm putting you a little bit on the spot here, but I'm just kind of
No,
curious.
that's okay. No, that's okay. So it sort of depends. So it depends on the client, what they're going to do with it, how important it is to the business.
Right.
Like just the classic consultant's answers.
Yep.
Always depends.
It depends.
But things you can look at. So you can look at which country it's made up in,
Oh, yeah.
which company makes it. That makes a big difference. Now, that's all feelings. I do want to point out that very large organizations, right, that have the luxury of having application testing teams or paying an external consultant software testing company to come in and test something. Like if it's going to be a business critical thing and they really, really want to know, right, and it's going to handle some very sensitive data for them, they often do that, right? They say, hey,
True.
can you test this piece of software for us? But of course, down here in SMB land, we don't have that.
Right.
We don't have that luxury. Do want to point out here again, not doing advertising for anybody here, but my clients use Defender for Cloud Apps, which is Microsoft's CASB, and that CASB does have a catalog. So last time I looked, it was 37,000, so it's probably close to 40,000 different cloud apps now. And for each of them, it has a risk score. And that is based on what country it comes from. Does it support, MFA? Does it have TLS? What's the legal? It is in 5 different categories, I think, where it breaks down where those risk factors come from. So that's a good indication when you're looking at a SaaS app. The only other thing I'd mention for an on-premises app, so Microsoft does have a system in their app control, I think it's called this week. They keep changing the name, but where you can sort of say, I allow applications to run on my endpoints that have a certain reputation score. And that is, again, sort of similar to what you were talking about, 18 installs in the last 3 months, right? Microsoft maintains a list of reputation for an app. And that's going to catch the very unusual things, right, that show up and somebody's trying to run or install this thing and it's going to say, nah, hang on a second. This is the second install on the planet in the last week. Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe not a good idea to run this thing. So,
and I really like this idea of a reputation score, because if I'm a CISO or I'm in your shoes trying to make a decision here, it makes my job a little bit easier, because I have yet to meet a person in our industry that has the time to, okay, I'm going to use this application and it has dependencies of this library, and this library. I'm going to go look at those libraries which have their own dependencies. And you end up in this seemingly infinite tree of software and dependencies. And yeah, if you want to go look at the source code for some of those open source libraries, you certainly can. But the one thing I want to point out here is, you may choose an application and it may have a dependency on this obscure open source library that is maintained by Ted in his garage in, I don't know, the other side of the planet, right? And it's been that way for 20 years. And the incident that I think of when I'm talking about this, it's kind of both the big benefit as well as kind of the downfall of open source software, right? That model, the benefits, the pros and cons, right? I think of XZUtils, and I think it was Michael Posey and we talked about XZUtils on this show quite a while back. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about here, XZUtils is an open source. It's a utility or library. I don't remember exactly what, but very, very popular open source tool package that's used in across the world. And there was a very rare situation. I've never seen or heard about this happening any other time, but a malicious actor had been seeming to be very helpful and help maintain XZUtils for about 2 years. And they started edging out the original maintainer. And then at some point they went to inject malicious code. And I don't remember exactly the details, but if I remember correctly, the code they added when paired with the SSH service basically would have allowed a situation where they could bypass SSH authentication, which would
Yeah.
be devastating. I mean, we're talking like Mad Max levels of Armageddon. You know what I mean? Like,
If they have it, you had a specific key. It was the
right.
Russians. We pretty much know that by now.
Yep.
It was the Russians, and it was literally giving them like a golden key to bypass SSH. Now,
Yep.
it had made it into some like pre-release testing
Correct.
builds of a few Linux distributions, but it never made it into the mainstream ones,
Nope.
right? So it never went planet-wide. But that's only because this software engineer at Microsoft was running an open source database, and he was doing some testing, and he got some weird performance results. And dude's like, there's something weird going on here. And he keeps digging, and eventually finds this thing, right? But it would obviously probably have been found later on for the same performance reasons.
Right.
But the fact that he found it early, he's a hero in the cybersecurity
I was going to say,
industry.
I really hope somebody bought that guy a bottle of whiskey. So
I'm sure he got that.
at least I hope, but yeah, I mean, it all comes back to Jen Easterly's quote, right? Is that we have a software quality issue, and I don't know. I have a couple of thoughts on this. I think part of it is just the ecosystem that we've kind of built. It's just a result of the way we've done things for years and years and years. And that brings me to our next talking point. And I know you've got a pretty tall soapbox to stand on here for this this next bit. And I've got a pretty tall soapbox for this one too. But I'm going to let you run with this one, Paul, in talking about the analyst approach, right?
Yeah. So when it comes to selecting software, right, at least for the enterprise space, we have some interesting companies providing a service here, Gartner, Forrester, and the like, right? And they are meant to do testing of the leaders in the market, and they do them every year, so you can see whether your particular chosen software goes up or down in the leadership categories, etc. But to me, they are sort of missing the point. They are talking about the innovations and the leaders and the new features and those sorts of things. But the thing I want from a piece of software, I want it to do what it says on the tin, right? I want it to work. And I want good support. I want good documentation. I want great training, and that should all be publicly available, so you don't have to pay for that stuff. And like the good support is huge, right? That's whether you're like me, an MSP providing IT services to others, or you're an in-house IT admin, right? Because when things don't work as expected, you picking up the phone and getting a knowledgeable person at the other end who understands what the problem is and gives you a timely resolution, that's worth a lot more than, we've got this new shiny feature so that we can be in the leaders quadrant in Gartner next year. It's like, no, I don't care about that, actually.
Yep. Agreed. I always think of Microsoft support when I'm having conversations like this. Not modern Microsoft support, but I do remember there was a time many, many years ago when you opened a ticket with Microsoft, you would learn more about that particular issue than you ever wanted to know, right? I remember, I don't even remember what the specific issue was. I think we had a corrupt NTFS volume and no backups or something. I don't remember this back in my MSP days, but I remember like sitting down with the Microsoft support engineer for like 2 hours, and we were actually digging through the guts of NTFS. You know what I mean? And so it was just, you learned so much. But now, fast forward to today, it's quite common. I come across an email in a thread or a forum post or a one-on-one conversation where Microsoft support just doesn't get the praises that it used to, right? And to your point, it's one thing to, like I said, learn more about that issue than you ever wanted to know and have it resolved in a timely fashion, and then have to fight with support over a span of weeks, right? Which is compounded by cloud services versus on-premises. Whereas on-premises, you at least had more control, but I digress.
No, that's not a digression at all. And I think I do mention this in the article as well. I do think um, because we had more stability in the on-premises times, right? We had new versions every 3 years, which meant that the support engineers you talk to often were very knowledgeable. I've had
Yeah.
exactly the same experience as you. I will say I probably open a support case with Microsoft support, I don't know, every 2 to 3 months, something like that, something
Mm.
with my clients where I can't find the answer. And it's very hit and miss. I've had some great help where people have zeroed in on it pretty quickly and, yep, this is how it works. This is what you need to do to fix it. And I've had some real clangers. I've got an iPad sitting on the desk over there that was unjoined from our Intune because the lady suggested that that was a good way of fixing the problem, and I can't get it back into Intune, so I don't know what to do.
Well, it's not an
That's
Intune anymore,
another.
so it's not a problem anymore, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not a problem anymore. Works great.
Well, while we're
No.
having the analyst conversation, the one other thing I want to make sure we cover here is I've kind of had this feeling for a while, and we've talked about this on the show. I think it's been you and I that have talked about this, Paul, is that when we look at software, cloud, on-prem, or otherwise, right, the industry kind of rewards, both in accolades and monetarily rewards, those applications that have flashy, sexy new features and are quote unquote innovating, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we should also be rewarding those applications that are stable,
Mm-hmm.
secure, and
Mm-hmm.
operate as intended, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I
Yep.
think we have a fundamental industry issue with that model.
Yes. Yeah.
And we were talking when we were having the open source conversation earlier. I was thinking about this in the back of my mind. In that, I don't know if you're familiar with Debian Linux's kind of software mentality. When I think to myself, I need for whatever I'm doing, I need a rock solid operating system. I can think of nothing more stable than the stable branch of Debian Linux. I mean, they are super, super conservative. I mean, they're quite often a ways behind in feature sets, but that's because their whole point is stability, right? You could
Mm-hmm.
also get a little
Yeah.
bit of this in um, the Ubuntu long-term service releases, kind of the same
Mm-hmm.
idea. But then if I'm a Debian user and I want some of the newer stuff, I could upgrade to the testing distribution, right?
Mm-hmm.
For maybe a little bit, some bugs, but I get some of the newer stuff. Or if, I feel like going bleeding edge, I would run SID, which is their unstable distribution. And I feel like that could be a model that the industry could look at, right? I mean, if you still want to
Mm-hmm.
have the extreme innovation, at least give people the choice, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
my soapbox.
No, I completely agree with you. Let's move on to cybersecurity software.
That's true.
So we will include in the show notes some links to some presentation by Mudge. Peter Zadko, I think is his real name, but Mudge is his hacker handle. Of course, he's been around for a really long time. He
Right.
was the CISO for Twitter for a while there before they got taken over by Elon or bought by Elon. And he runs an organization called CITL, Cyber Independent Testing Lab,
Independent
something like
testing
that.
lab. Yep.
That's the
Correct.
ones. So we'll have the links to that, and you can have a look at some of their research. It's not particularly fresh. They're sort of billing themselves as consumer reports, but for software quality. But in the presentations, they talk a lot about the fact that cybersecurity software and software in general are not so secure as you might think. And that's really, really important and disheartening. So one of their findings really is that, yes, for the major browsers and the major operating systems, those organizations have armies of software engineers. They have they have bug bounty programs. They have tried and tested ways of fixing bugs. They upgrade often, and security is a focus. Like if you're part of the Chromium team writing the Chromium open source engine, or if you're part of the Windows security team, that's all you do. Like that's your job, keeping Windows or Mac OS or iOS or whatever secure, right? But that's when we in the industry talk about those, that's literally like saying, oh, my Lamborghini is better than your Ferrari, right? Like you're talking about high precision sports cars that are very expensive and very, very well maintained. But for every other piece of software you use in your daily life, a line of business applications, SaaS applications, they are Toyotas or Fiats or Holdens, if we're here in Australia, or whatever else brand you want to pick that are not in the top tier of quality of cars. And in those cases, it turns out that patching doesn't actually make you more secure. Yes, if there is a known vulnerability and you patch it with the latest version that's come out, okay, you fix that vulnerability. But overall, they don't have teams of engineers focusing on security. It is not a high priority for them, and they don't fix it at the rate that you would expect them to fix it, which means that adding new versions of the software is literally just adding more complexity and more risk to your platform, to your infrastructure. Right.
Yeah, it's a unfortunate reality. And I mean, when you look at those software patches, again, we're setting major operating systems and browsers to the side for the moment, right? When you look at line of business apps or whatever, when they release a new version, it's because they've added feature X or feature Y, or they've improved this function over here, right? And rarely is it for security reasons. And the other, I've experienced this with many apps over the years. You experience a bug, they release a patch to fix said bug, and then they release a new version with new functionality, and guess what? There's a bug regression, and that bug you originally dealt with comes back, And so, I mean, it's like, how much of a focus is the code, the existing code at that point, right? And I know I'm speaking in generalities. That doesn't apply to every single software developer out there, but this is where we're at, right?
Very much so. One of the things I mentioned is the article is Michael Howard. He is a senior something person. I can't remember his title at Microsoft, and he's been there for decades. And he wrote the book Writing Secure Code, which was sort of the required reading for everybody at Microsoft back in the trustworthy computing memo days when Bill Gates went out and say, hey, we've got to do security. And they developed the secure development lifecycle at Microsoft back 20 years ago. And we know that helped Microsoft then, and we have had other podcasts, you and I, where we talked about that they've slipped a bit and they seem to be back on track now. We'll see how that goes. Yep. But the point he's making in a recent podcast interview, as in a few weeks ago, was that the graduates that are coming out of college, university with their software, computer software degrees, they don't know how to write secure code. It is not part of the curriculum enough. So literally they're hiring people at Microsoft and Google and all the other places, presumably, and the first thing they have to do is sit them down to teach them how to write secure code instead of just writing code. And that to me is absolutely flabbergasting. There seems to be an idea in academia that it's not their job. But that to me is like saying, we teach engineering, but we don't worry too much about making sure the bridges don't fall down. That's not really the important thing. We teach the cool things about how to make a beam and calculate how they should sit together, but we don't worry too much about the security. And that's just, there's something wrong there. Like and I know many developers, and I know they are, the ones I know, they are focused on security, but I think in many, many, many organizations where you have software developers, apart from the Lamborghinis and Ferraris we talked about, in nearly every other place, it's getting the feature out the door. It is not getting the feature out the door and making sure it's secure before you get it out the door.
Right. And you can say this about probably any skill, but I feel like for security specifically, there is value to length of time that you are studying and focused on that particular skill, right? Because I mean, I know things about security today that, I mean, heck, even a year ago would have been completely foreign to me, right? And I mean,
Mm.
as you become more experienced, focusing on, developing secure code, the better you are. And I guess my point here is that I there has to be a length of time where you're a developer, but this again, I'm speaking in generalities. I'm not speaking to everybody, but I feel like there's probably a minimum amount of time where you have to be focused on developing secure code before you are actually able to develop secure code. You know what I mean? There's like a minimum
Absolutely.
time period there. And so my point, coming back to your mention about universities and academia, is like, it seems like that should be standard fare for
Hmm.
developers, right? But that's just me.
Well, I think, and this is again, I'm completely speculating here. I haven't got a computer science degree, so I wouldn't know. But I would say that one of the reasons some of the industry knowledge people say this is because a lot of those lecturers probably don't know how to do it. That's probably one of
Yeah.
the reasons, right? Because it is a different mindset, thinking about not only how do I write this software so that it does what it's meant to do, right? Like how do I follow the specification? How do I make sure it's working? How do I catch any errors? How do I manage all of that? It is also thinking in a different way, and I think it's a cultural thing. I think it is, how do you do it? And that's why they're saying when we hire these people, the first thing we have to do is send them off back to school
Yeah.
to teach them. Because at our organization, everyone who writes software has to write secure software. Like there is no other option. You can't sort of work in the division where you write unsecure software. It's like, that's not an option.
Right.
So, yeah.
I had coffee with Matt Lee from PAX 8. He's been a guest on the show before. He was here in Grand Rapids not that long ago. And him and a couple of his buddies, they were working on a project called The Hacketing, where that's what they called it, The Hacketing. And basically, they were actually hacking participating MSPs, right?
Mhm.
And I mean, Matt's been in security for a while, right? And he's a guy I look up to. He's very knowledgeable in security, and he said something in that conversation that I think of now that we're having this conversation. In that, um, you know, I forget exactly how he worded it, but basically saying that sometimes in order to defend properly, like you need to understand how the attacker would exploit the
Yeah.
system, whatever it is you're securing, right? Because you can put up all the walls you want, if you don't really understand how the threat actor is going to exploit whatever it is you're guarding, you can't
Hmm.
really guard it, right? And
Yeah.
so I think it's not just enough that developers, and again, I'm speaking as a non-developer here, so if any developers out there are like,
Me
Andy,
too.
you're wrong, hop on our LinkedIn group in the description.
More than happy to
And
hear it. I'm not a developer
exactly.
either. Go on.
But I think developers not only need to know how to develop secure code, they need to understand how threat actors could
Yeah.
exploit bad code, right?
Yeah.
And that's my
Yeah,
bit on
that's
that's my
yeah,
piece
yeah,
there.
no, no, absolutely. That is absolutely it. And I suppose also the big challenge for all of us is that it's a changing landscape. It's not like you could write your university curriculum 10 years ago and saying, okay, we got to teach secure coding. These are the risks to your secure coding, right? Like people today are learning different languages. The threat landscape is completely different. The way
Right.
attackers operate is completely different. The way they're resourced is completely different because it's now organized crime and they got lots of money and they can do lots of research. There's a whole plus. Security is so much more than just the software quality. I mean, we're focusing on the software quality here, but the reason a lot of people get compromised is not necessarily because the software they're using sucks from a security point of view, but because they, didn't look at the link properly, or they got a
Yep.
phone call that they thought was legit but wasn't.
Or supply chain stuff. I don't
Yes,
remember who it was I
that's
was
right.
talking to about. Was it you I was talking with about supply chain stuff? I was having that conversation recently. I don't remember
We
who.
have had that conversation. I don't know if this one was it.
And it kind of came up again recently. I came across a Reddit thread where somebody had been purchasing, for their organization, they purchased a bunch of refurbished PCs. And a bunch of these PCs came like pre-infected with malware. And I don't know if it's because you and I have recently had, as of this recording, we have recently had the UEFI and Windows Secure Boot conversation. But my mind immediately went to rootkit and bootkit, because what they were describing really sounded like that it was persisting through reinstalls, and I'm like, this has got to be a case of rootkit, bootkit, and that machine just needs to go in the wood chipper, right? So anyway,
yeah. Pre-loved. So we here in Australia, we call them op shops, opportunity shops, and I'm sure you have them over there in the US as well. So this is where you give your secondhand stuff to, right, and then they sell it, and the money generally goes to some sort of charity, right? So you can go and buy pre-loved clothing or pre-loved furniture. So here you're getting pre-installed malware. You don't even have to click on the link yourself. It comes free when you buy the computer.
Preload ransomware. You're welcome. Oh boy. Oh, good times. Anyway, I think we've about covered everything that we talked about in your article. I know on the second page of your article, Paul, we've got, kind of the applications versus cloud services, but we've kind of covered that already earlier in our discussion.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add there before we wrap up?
Last bit I mentioned in the article is that Azure or Microsoft is now publishing CVEs, something we have mentioned on the show before. Yep. They're publishing CVEs for flaws they find in, or external researchers find in Azure, even if there is no customer action required, right? So that was something that you and I talked about that gives us more of an indication of, what the flaws are, even if there isn't anything we can do about it as customers. And apparently AWS is following suit there as well. So I like that. I think overall, the real problem here is that technology has gone in the last 20, 30 years from a niche thing that businesses were dabbling in to see whether they could make themselves a little bit more productive instead of typing on typewriters, to type in, Microsoft Word 2.0 or something, where I started. We are now living in a society and a world and in business where everything is driven by technology, and every company is a technology company. But I don't think that the way we write software, the way we operate our infrastructure hasn't really kept up. And I think we're not, as an industry, we need to start taking this a bit more seriously and start valuing, as you said, stability, security, does what it says on the tin, more than the new shiny feature.
Yep. Agreed. And I'm hoping when we have this conversation again a year or two from now, we will see some positive steps in that direction. I'm not confident, but I can hope, right? So there we are. Well, fingers crossed. That's right. Well, Paul, I want to thank you for spending some time with us today. Again, folks, I'm going to link Paul's article in the show notes. There we go. So you can take a look at that in case you want to. But again, Paul, thanks for being here. Always good having you, my friend.
It was a great conversation. Thanks, Andy.
Definitely. And those of you watching, hopefully you found some value in today's conversation. If you're watching on the YouTubes, be sure to smash that like and subscribe button. Otherwise, we're available on all the major podcasting platforms. So chances are, wherever you consume your content, you can find us. With that, we'll let you get back to your day and hope to see you again next week for a future episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Have a good one.